Hello everyone, I'm Chris Wehner, and today we've got a very special video for you. Today's topic is 3 PLO strategies that most pros miss that will make you more money in Pot Limit Omaha. This is the fourth of 4 videos in the series Dylan Weissman and myself have been putting out leading up to our launch of our course Advanced PLO Mastery, available Monday, March 2nd on upswingpoker.com. Make sure to stick around after these 3 strategies for a special sneak peek tour of the course by Dylan Weissman. With that said, without further ado, let's get on to the 3 spots. Here are 3 PLO strategies that most pros miss. The first strategy we're going to cover today is leading the flop as a small blind after calling preflop. If we dive into Bunker Solver and open this 6-handed solved preflop sim, and if the action folds around to the button, we see that unsurprisingly he's opening close to half of his range here. And also probably unsurprisingly to most of us, the small blind is playing very tight, only calling about 8% of hands, 3-betting 10%, and largely folding. In the instance that the small blind does call, the big blind is getting to defend much wider. He can't get squeezed behind. He's going to have a better position post-flop, so he's calling about half of his hands. So if we use those ranges, we can arrive at a flop, such as Jack-Jack-8 Rainbow, for example, where we're in a 3-handed single-raised pot. And small blind is obviously first to act, and when given the option to check or to use a small block bet, we see perhaps surprisingly here that the small blind is block betting almost 2/3 of his range. And that's easily described whenever we open up the equity graph function and look at how ranges interact here. The small blind is the blue line, and we see that he's doing very well in this situation. On a board like this, the small blind has an equity advantage in the polarity end of ranges. He's doing very well here in the strongest hands. He also has an equity advantage in the middle of ranges, and overall he has about 40% equity in this spot. So when he's doing that well, and the weakest range of the 3 on a board like this is the big blind, what's going to happen is the small blind is often going to be leading to deny some equity to the big blind, and the button will respond with both some calls and raises. So I think this is a spot where a lot of people are just autopilot checking their entire range as the small blind. A couple more examples of the same phenomenon. Whenever we change the board from Jack-Jack-8 Rainbow to King-King-4 two-tone, we offer small blind the same option. We see that this is essentially the same position, and the small blind again should be leading the vast majority of his range. Again, small blind being the blue line here. In this situation, he has a hair over 40% equity, with again the weaker range being the big blind only having 26% equity and doing very poorly on some of these paired high card paired boards like Jack-Jack-8 or King-King-4, both rainbow and two-tone. One final example of this, if we change the texture to King-Queen-7 in the same spot, this situation being a cutoff open rather than a button open, to illustrate that this concept still holds true even if the preflop opener has a tighter range. In this situation, we go into this end of the course about optimal bet sizes. This player prefers to size a little larger, so we give him the 40% option here to lead rather than the 20% option. And when given this option, he's leading 66% of the time again. Pulling up the equity graph a third time, we see the same situation where the small blind flatter is doing very well range versus range here versus his opponent. So these type of boards, these Jack-Jack-8s, King-King-4s, King-Queen-7s, Queen-10-5s, these type of boards are going to get led a ton by the small blind. His strategy is actually much closer to leading this board with his entire range than it is to checking this board with his entire range. So we'll go into more detail in the course, but just for now, know that those boards are really good to lead as the small blind. When the board is ace high, it becomes a little bit worse because the small blind does not have an advantage in the pocket aces region. But a lot of these high card centric boards, aside from ace high boards, are very good small blind leads. The second PLO strategy that most pros are missing is that we should be adjusting our c-betting frequencies depending on whether or not our opponent is playing a leading range. For example, following the example from the first tip that we just showed, this is a situation where the button has opened preflop at a 6 max table and the small blind has defended. You'll recognize that this board is quite similar to the boards we looked at in the first tip, being that it's very high card centric and is going to be a high frequency lead for the small blind. We see that reflected here, that whenever the small blind is given the option to lead, he's using it at almost 70% frequency. So when he's given the option to lead, but chooses not to take it, but rather checks, we see that as the button here, we get to c-bet a reasonable amount at 35%. This isn't super high. This is a board that's very strong for our opponent. But when he's given the option to lead and doesn't take it, we have a fairly healthy c-betting frequency here. Whereas if we run the same spot, but now we're playing against a small blind who doesn't even consider leading this board, maybe he hasn't done his homework and doesn't know that this is a very good board for him and just automatically autopilot checks his entire range. When he checks to the button, now instead of being able to c-bet 35% of the time, the button should only be c-betting 15% of the time. So the button's c-betting less than half as often as he was versus the opponent who plays some leads but chose not to. So it's up to us to identify whether or not our opponents are thinking about leading ranges in these situations where they should, and to adjust our c-betting strategies accordingly, depending on whether or not our opponents are implementing those leading ranges when they do check. And now our third and final example of a PLO strategy that most pros miss. We should be jamming brick turns on a number of runouts at a fairly high frequency after 3-betting and check calling the flop. For example, let's say we are in a common situation like this where the button opens, small blind folds, and we're in the big blind. We have a strong hand, we go ahead and 3-bet at about a 10% frequency, and the button defends. We'll often find ourselves at an SPR like this, around SPR 4. For example, let's say the board is 9-7-3-2 tone. This is a situation where we will be checking about half of our range, as we see here. So we do check, and a common line that will occur is that when villain is checked to, he'll prefer around a half pot sizing, or a little less, which he uses here. And we see that our most frequent response is to call. So fairly often, after 3-betting and seeing a board like this, the flop will go check, bet, call. Now the surprising thing here is that after the flop takes that action, let's say we get a brick turn like the deuce. I think a lot of players, pros especially here, are autopiloting and checking their entire range on a card like this, whereas the solver is actually finding a lot of aggression here and jamming a tad over half of its range on the turn. This is a line that I don't see very often in any of the games I play. I think people are finding these jams sometimes whenever they turn equity. Maybe they turn a higher pair with a higher flush draw, something like an ace or a king turn. But the deuce here interacts so poorly with the button's range that bet this flop when checked to, that we're often better off just open jamming a lot of the combinations we arrive to the turn here with, rather than checking and giving the button an opportunity to check behind. Now, of course, we wouldn't play this strategy on different turns that were more interactive with the flop, that were better for our opponent. Notice that we never use the small size or the medium size here, because on a texture like this, denying equity is so important that we're either checking or open jamming. If we contrast that to a slightly different turn in the same spot, being the 3 of diamonds rather than the 2 of diamonds, we see that we're actually using a much higher aggression frequency on this turn than we were before. This turn may be more intuitive to players because when the bottom card pairs here, our over pairs gain a lot of equity. And we see that we're almost betting our entire range. Nonetheless, now instead of just simply open jamming, denying equity becomes less important on a turn that's drier like this and more static. So we see that we're using a variety of sizes, from a small size to a medium size to a large size. So the main takeaway from this spot is that on some turns, such as an offsuit deuce that don't interact with the button's range who bet the flop, we don't need to check our whole range or anything near it. We get to open jam a ton of it. And on a low board pairing turn, this is going to be another really common turn for us to play a ton of turn aggression, where we're betting essentially our entire range. So those were 3 PLO strategies that most pros miss. Now at this point, if you're feeling like these strategies that you're seeing Monk or Solver play are a little bit abstract, that's totally fine. That's right where you should be at this point. One of the benefits of continual exposure to solver work is that it makes us aware that these strategies exist at equilibrium. Without this exposure, we may never even think about implementing them. It's our job to take these strategies to the next step by thinking about the circumstances and the conditions that Monk or Solver is operating under when it's implementing these strategies, and comparing those circumstances to the parameters that we're playing at in our everyday games. And that's really what this course does, is it takes a lot of these outputs that are demonstrated in this video that are showing what Monker Solver is doing and explains to you why Monker Solver is doing it, so that you know when you can apply them and when maybe you shouldn't apply them in your own games. These examples of these couple strategies today are really just the tip of the iceberg. Monker Solver does tons of abstract things like this that we're probably not thinking about without exposure to this sort of information. So that's what the course is really about. And from this point, I'm going to toss it over to Dylan Weissman to give you guys a sneak peek of the course.
Great explanation, Chris. For everyone out there who is stoked on Chris's way of thinking and wants to learn more about the game of PLO, as you all know, we have the Advanced PLO Mastery course coming out March 2nd on upswingpoker.com. What I want to do for you right now is actually give you a quick walkthrough of what you'll get if you purchase the course. So let's dive into it right now. The first thing you see here on the homepage is an introduction video from yours truly, Dylan Weissman, as well as every section of the course. So the course is broken down into 8 tenets: the introduction, pre-flop, flop, turn, river, centralized spotlights, which we'll talk about in a little bit, professional fundamentals, and play and explains. The introduction section is different than introductions for most other courses. Let's click into it right now and see what you get. So the first thing that we do, which we do throughout almost the entirety of this course, is give you a breakdown of how to best interact with the material. Our intention for this course wasn't just to make the most badass, fully inclusive Pot Limit Omaha course ever created, but to help you use it effectively to learn. What we noticed both in user feedback and in other people that have bought Upswing courses or bought courses from other sites in the past is that they like the material, but they're not great at learning with it. So Chris and I's intention throughout the entirety of this course is to create learning management tools that help you interact. That's going to include lessons such as this one, which is how to best interact with the course material. It's going to include something like these fundamental tools, which you'll see here, which gives you the necessary fundamental tools to actually best learn from what we're giving you. It also includes tons of quizzes. So let's actually hop in and find a quiz for you right now. So let's go into the pre-flop section. Here in pre-flop, you're going to see that we have the different base components of pre-flop broken down for you. So it's like intro to pre-flop, your RFI and cold call ranges, your 3 bets and squeezes, your 4 and 5 bets. Let's click into RFI and cold call. So you'll see here, when you go into, for example, cold call and blind defense, there's going to be a video detailing everything that you need for cold calls and blind defense, as well as spreadsheets that Chris uses in order to actually have material for you to study on your own, as well as quizzes. So let's actually look at one of these quizzes right now. Start the quiz. Pretty much as more players enter the pot, the requirement for us to enter the pot increases and decreases. I'm not going to tell you the answer, but I want you to think about it. It's a little hint and a teaser for the type of material we cover. So as I said, we're going to have material like this throughout the entire course for pre-flop, flop, turn, and river. And what Chris and I really intended to do, specifically in this fundamental theory section, is build your Pot Limit Omaha game from the ground up. And that's really important. We want you to be able to interact with this material in such a way where if you're starting from nothing, which a lot of you aren't, you can build a fully functional, game theory oriented approach to Pot Limit Omaha. And that's what the fundamental theory section covers. Centralized spotlights are for those of us that maybe don't want, like, it's important for everyone to study the fundamental theory, but the centralized spotlights makes it easier. So what we have here are range asymmetries. This is where we have our Pot Limit Omaha multi-table tournament strategy, 4 videos of it. We have videos that will maybe take some of the more complex concepts that you'll get in the fundamental theory section and break them down in easier ways to understand, like flush completing turns, pre-flop mistakes you're probably making, as well as bias and critical thinking in poker. The centralized spotlights are meant to help you more easily digest the information in this course. Next, we have our professional fundamentals, which is, in my opinion, really important. I'm a little biased, but this is the mental game section of the course. What Chris and I were really focusing on is not just making you good at PLO, but making you a well-rounded poker enthusiast, professional, whatever it is. You need to be able to execute effectively. That means having a very solid strategy, as well as being comfortable in the more nuanced and emotional aspects of being a poker player. And that's where the professional fundamentals come in. Other than that, we have a Play and Explain series. I'm so hyped on this Play and Explain series. It is gnarly how much content there is in here. We have a 7-part series against Phil Galfond where Chris dives in deep in Munker to all the biggest pots they played heads up. And then we have these 2 series, Chris reviewing 2 live professionals. And I've never seen content as in-depth as these live videos for the Play and Explain. The reason being that Chris went and ran literally every single spot through Munker and then describes them to you in a very flowy fashion. So you don't have to go into Munker to get the fundamentals here. It's as if you're playing and you have Munker itself sitting over your shoulder and saying, hey, that was a raise, or hey, that was 1 pip too wide. Chris is doing that in depth for players who are already winners in the games. You're not going to find value like that. You're not going to find cohesive content like that anywhere than in the Advanced PLO Mastery course. I'm incredibly excited to bring it to you. I know Chris is as well. And we really hope that the material not only resonates with you, but helps you grow as a poker player. Thanks for watching this video. Make sure to look out for the Advanced PLO Mastery course on March 2nd. That's when it launches. For that first week, when you purchase, you get the live PLO dominance course, which is completely focused on how to become a more badass and sustainable live poker player. So look out for that. Make sure you sign up for the first week to get that additional content and enjoy everything that we put out. There's going to be so much more content coming out from us in the next week. We want to get y'all hyped. There'll be content from me. There'll be content from Chris. There's a couple special guests that we haven't announced yet who's going to be doing content with us. So stay tuned for all that and have a great day.